On the 4th of May, 1903, Judge James B. Markham stood on the steps of the Breathitt County Courthouse. He was a man of the law, a symbol of order in a land that had forgotten the meaning of the word. A single shot echoed from a nearby window, sharp and final. The judge staggered back into his own courthouse and fell dead, a public execution designed to send a chilling message. In this corner of Kentucky, the only law that mattered came from the barrel of a gun. This was not an isolated act. It was a declaration of war in a place that had already earned its name, bloody Breathitt. Was this a county of savages, or was it a place where honorable men were locked in a desperate battle for the very soul of the mountains? The truth, as always, is far more complicated and far more terrifying. Today, we trace the story of how power, greed, and an ancient code of honor turned a quiet county into a battlefield. To understand the blood that was spilled, you must first understand the ground that soaked it up. Late 19th century Breathitt County was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of fog-choked hollows and ancient hills that guarded its secrets fiercely. It was a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, not by the clocks of a distant government. The people here were bound to the land and to each other by ties of blood and shared hardship. They were proud, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of any authority that didn't carry their last name. The deepest scar on the soul of these mountains was the Civil War. Kentucky was a border state, a fractured land where loyalties were a personal and often fatal choice. In Breathitt, neighbor fought neighbor, and in some tragic cases, brother fought brother. When the official war ended, the fighting did not. Men returned home not to peace, but to simmering resentment. They brought their rifles with them, along with the grim knowledge that violence was a swift and effective way to settle a dispute. The old Union and Confederate grudges never truly died. They just became the fault lines for the family wars that would follow. This brutal history reinforced an older, unwritten law, the Code of the Mountains. In this isolated world, family was everything. It was your government, your army, and your only true safety net. An insult delivered to your cousin was an insult delivered to you, and it demanded an answer. Justice wasn't something you waited for a judge in a powdered wig to dispense. It was something you took yourself, often at the end of a path with a rifle in your hands. This wasn't seen as murder, it was seen as balancing the scales. This code was born of necessity. When your nearest neighbor is a mile away and the county seat is a day's hard ride, you learn to solve your own problems. A man's word was his bond, and his honor was his most valuable possession, worth more than his land, his livestock, or even his life. To have it challenged publicly was an unforgivable offense. It was this fierce, uncompromising sense of personal honor that would serve as the trigger for so much of the violence to come. Into this crucible of old wounds and rigid honor, a new element was introduced: progress, or what passed for it. Timber and coal barons from the north began to see the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. The railroad snaked its way into the hollows, bringing with it outside money, slick lawyers, and a lust for the region's vast natural wealth. Suddenly, control of the local courthouse wasn't just about settling local disputes. It was about controlling land deeds, mineral rights, and fortunes beyond imagination. This collision of worlds created the men who would fight the Breathitt County War. They were forged by the Civil War's lingering hatreds, governed by an ancient code of clan loyalty, and now tempted by a wave of new greed. They were men who believed their honor was worth dying for, and who were now being told that their entire world was for sale to the highest bidder. The storm was inevitable. Before the assassinations and the arrival of the state militia, there was a tense, fragile peace in Breathitt County. You have to imagine the town of Jackson in those days, a place of dusty streets and watchful eyes, where the future of the entire region was being decided not in an election booth, but in the quiet conversations held in hotel lobbies and general stores. It was a community living on a powder keg, but for a time, it was still a community. At the center of one world, was Judge James "Jim" Hargis. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a corrupt political boss who ruled with an iron fist. But to his supporters, and there were many, he was the patriarch of Breathitt County. The Hargis Hotel wasn't just a building, it was the capital of an unofficial kingdom. On any given day, you could find Jim Hargis there, holding court. A farmer might come to him to settle a land dispute. A young man might ask for a loan to start a family. Hargis was the law, the bank, and the government all rolled into one. He understood the mountain people because he was one of them. He provided a kind of stability, a predictable order. It was his order, to be sure, but in a chaotic world, that was something. He had built a dynasty of power, and he aimed to protect it and the people who lived under his influence. On the other side stood men like Judge James B. Markham and Ed Callahan. They represented a different vision for the mountains. Markham wasn't a patriarch, he was a lawyer. He believed in the power of books, of precedent, of a justice that was blind and applied equally to all men, regardless of their last name. He saw the Hargis machine as a cancer, a corrupting force that kept Breathitt County trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. He fought his battles in the courtroom, armed with legal briefs and righteous indignation, seeking to dismantle the little Czar's empire from within. Ed Callahan was the embodiment of that same fight, but he met it on the streets. He was a respected and fearless lawman, a man who believed his badge should mean something. Where Hargis commanded loyalty through favors and fear, Callahan earned respect through raw courage. He was the man who would walk into a saloon to disarm a drunkard when no one else dared, the man who would serve a warrant on a known killer. He and Markham were the face of the Reform Party, and they were fighting for a future where a man's success depended on his merits, not on his allegiance to a political boss. For a while, these two worlds coexisted. The Hargis men would walk on one side of the street, the Callahan men on the other. Business was conducted, families were raised, and life went on under a veneer of civility. But everyone knew the peace was hollow. These were not just two political factions, they were two fundamentally different futures vying for control of the same small patch of earth. One side was fighting to protect the world they had built, the other was fighting to build a new one. Both believed they were in the right. And in the mountains of Kentucky, when two sides both believe they are right, the result is almost always bloodshed. But peace is a fragile thing, and in every great tragedy, there is a crack in the armor of the men who stand at its center. For James Hargis, that flaw was a pride as old and unyielding as the mountains themselves. His control over Breathitt County was not a political office, it was his birthright. He had built his world through sheer force of will, and he could not tolerate the slightest challenge to his authority. To him, opposition was not a difference of opinion. It was a declaration of personal war. This wasn't the hot-headed pride of a young brawler. It was a cold, calculating force. They say that years earlier, a merchant in town had dared to publicly support one of Hargis's political rivals. Hargis didn't send men with guns. He did something far worse. He quietly passed the word. The man's credit was cut off at the bank. His suppliers suddenly had trouble filling his orders. Friends who had known him for 20 years would cross the street to avoid speaking to him. Within a year, the man was bankrupt and broken, forced to leave the county in shame. Jim Hargis didn't just defeat his enemies, he unmade them. This absolute refusal to share or cede power was his great strength, and it would become the engine of the coming war. The fatal flaw of the reformers, of men like Judge Markham and Ed Callahan, was the mirror image of Hargis's pride. It was a rigid, almost naive faith in the power of the law itself. They truly believed that the system, if followed correctly, was strong enough to protect them. They believed that a court order held more power than a Winchester rifle, and that a properly filed indictment could bring down a king. They saw the corruption of the Hargis machine and believed they could dismantle it piece by piece with the tools of their trade: legal arguments, witness testimony, and appeals to a higher authority. When the threats against them began, whispered in the street and delivered in unsigned notes. Their response was to seek injunctions and write letters to the governor in Frankfurt. They trusted in a process that Jim Hargis had spent a lifetime learning how to manipulate and control from the inside. They were honorable men trying to play by the rules in a game where their opponent had already burned the rulebook. This faith in paper and ink, in a world that still answered to lead and steel, would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. And so the stage was set. On one side, a man whose pride would not allow him to bend. On the other, men whose principles would not allow them to break. It was a collision of two opposing kinds of stubbornness, two incompatible definitions of justice. In the suffocating quiet of the Kentucky mountains, there was no longer any room for compromise. A single spark was all that was needed to make the whole valley burn. The spark finally landed in 1902. It wasn't a public argument or a contested election. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle in the dark. The target was James Cockrell, the town marshal of Jackson. But Cockrell was more than just a lawman. He was Jim Hargis's right hand. He was the muscle that backed up the little Czar's quiet orders, the walking, breathing symbol of the Hargis machine's control over the streets. When Cockrell walked by, people understood who was in charge. His authority flowed directly from the rocking chair in the Hargis Hotel. One evening, he was cut down from ambush. It was a classic FEUD-style killing, a shot from the shadows, with no warning and no chance to fight back. In the code of the mountains, this was more than murder. It was an act of profound disrespect. It was a message, written in gunpowder and blood, sent directly to Jim Hargis. It said, "Your man is not safe. Your power is not absolute. Your walls can be breached." For a man like Jim Hargis, whose entire world was built on a foundation of unshakable authority, this was the ultimate insult. His pride, the very core of his being, had been publicly challenged in the most brutal way imaginable. This wasn't a legal matter to be sorted out by investigators and juries. This was a personal attack on his house, his name, and his honor. The gears of the official law were too slow, too uncertain. The only justice that mattered now was the swift, terrible justice of the clan. The Hargis faction didn't wait for proof. In their minds, there was only one group with the motive and the audacity to carry out such an act: the Callahan-Markham reformers. The accusation was made instantly and publicly. The word went out through the hollers and across the ridges. The opposition had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had spilled first blood. That single shot changed everything. It tore away the thin veil of civility that had covered the county's tensions. The conflict was no longer about politics or legal maneuvering. It had become a blood feud. The time for filing motions in court was over. The time for filing coffins had begun. The cycle of vengeance, that terrible grinding engine of mountain warfare, had been switched on. And once it starts, it doesn't stop until it runs out of bodies to consume. In the days that followed James Cockrell's murder, a heavy silence fell over Breathitt County. It was the silence of a held breath, the kind of quiet that comes before a lightning strike. The elders of the community, men who still carried the scars of the Civil War, saw the signs. They had seen this kind of storm gather before. Preachers took to their pulpits, pleading for peace. Respected old men, who owed allegiance to neither faction, went as intermediaries, their hats in their hands, begging for calm and reason. They warned that this was a fire that, once lit, would consume the innocent along with the guilty. These warnings fell on deaf ears. They went to the Hargis Hotel and spoke to the little Czar himself. Jim Hargis would listen to them patiently, his face a mask of cold granite. He would offer them a drink, thank them for their concern, and then show them the door. In his mind, their pleas for peace were an insult. How could there be peace when his man lay in the ground, struck down from the dark? To compromise now, to let the matter be handled by a slow and corruptible legal system, would be a show of weakness. It would be an admission that his power, his very authority over the county, could be challenged with impunity. His response was not to de-escalate, but to tighten his grip. Known gunmen and loyalists, men like Curtis Jett and Tom White, began to appear more frequently on the streets of Jackson, their presence a silent promise of retribution. On the other side, the same desperate pleas were made to Judge Markham and Ed Callahan. Friends and family begged them to be careful, to leave town for a while and let the situation cool down. A living dog is better than a dead lion, they were told. But their own unbending principles made this impossible. Judge Markham saw it as his sworn duty to uphold the law, especially when it was under attack. To flee would be to surrender the courthouse and the very idea of justice to the forces of intimidation. He believed with every fiber of his being that the shield of the law was strong enough to protect him. Ed Callahan, a lawman to his core, refused to be intimidated. He continued his patrols, served his warrants, and walked the streets of Jackson as if nothing had changed. He rejected the idea of surrounding himself with a heavy guard, arguing that a sheriff who had to hide behind a wall of rifles was no sheriff at all. They put their faith in the system. They wrote letters to the governor detailing the threats. They tried to empanel a grand jury. They fought back not with guns, but with affidavits and legal motions, believing that the truth written on paper would ultimately prevail over the lies whispered in the shadows. Every attempt at peace became just another step towards war. When neutral citizens tried to form a committee for public safety, both sides accused it of being a front for the other. When the governor sent a tepid message urging a peaceful resolution, it was seen as a sign of weakness from the state, emboldening the hardliners. The town of Jackson was no longer a community. It was two armed camps staring at each other across a dusty main street. The path of compromise had vanished, overgrown with pride on one side and principle on the other. Every man in Breathitt County had to choose a side, and everyone knew that the talking was over. The air in Jackson had grown so thick with hate you could taste it. The threats against Judge Markham were no longer whispers. They were shouted in the street. His friends stopped visiting after dark. Notes were left on his doorstep, crude and clear in their meaning. The world was closing in on him, and everyone knew a final terrible line was about to be crossed. This was the moment for one last off-ramp, one final chance to turn back from the abyss. That chance came, as it so often does, in the quiet of his own home. The story goes that on the night before he died, his wife came to him, her face pale with a fear that was beyond tears. She begged him, not as a political figure, but as her husband and the father of her children. "James, let us leave this place," she pleaded. "Let's go somewhere the names Hargis and Callahan mean nothing. What good is the law if it leaves your children without a father?" It was the clearest choice a man could face. His duty on one hand, his life and family on the other. It was a direct plea to the man, not the judge. For a long moment, Markham was silent. He was not a fool. He knew the danger was not just real, it was imminent. He could see the logic in his wife's plea, could picture a life of peace far away from the blood-soaked soil of Breathitt County. He could have packed a bag, taken his family, and been gone by sunrise. No one would have called him a coward. They would have called him a sensible man who chose to live. This was the crossroads. He could choose to be a husband and father, or he could choose to be a symbol. But the judge's faith in the law was as unbending as a rod of iron. He looked at his wife, and with a heavy heart, he made his decision. If a circuit judge can be run out of his own courthouse by threats, he told her, then there is no law in these mountains. There is only the rule of the gun. And if that is the case, then our children have no future here anyway. I will not run. He believed to his very soul that to back down would be to hand a final victory to the forces of anarchy. He had to believe the system he served was worth dying for. In that moment, he consciously rejected the path of peace and fully committed to his tragic course. He sealed his own fate not with anger or pride, but with a quiet, resolute sense of duty. The conversation was over. The last chance for a different outcome had passed. He would go to the courthouse in the morning, as he had every other morning. He would stand on those steps and face whatever came. He had made his choice. The morning of May the 4th, 1903, dawned like any other. The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Jackson. Inside the Breathitt County Courthouse, the air was thick with the familiar smell of old paper and stale tobacco. Judge James B. Markham presided over his cases, his voice calm and steady, a small island of order in an ocean of simmering chaos. When the day's business was done, he walked out onto the front steps, pausing for a moment to speak with a friend, the tension of the courtroom momentarily behind him. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sound, sharp and violent, cracked the afternoon calm. It was not a firecracker. It was a single, deliberate report that echoed off the brick buildings and sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. For a split second, there was only confusion. Judge Markham felt a tremendous, invisible force strike him in the chest, a blow so powerful it staggered him backward and stole the air from his lungs. He looked at his friend, a question in his eyes, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. He looked down. On the crisp white fabric of his shirt, a dark stain was beginning to bloom, spreading like a fatal flower. The abstract threats, the whispered warnings, the pleas of his wife, it all became real in that single, horrific instant. The long, complex legal argument he had been making against the powers that ran Breathitt County was over. A final, brutal rebuttal had just been delivered from a window across the street. His instincts, the instincts of a man whose entire life revolved around that building, took over. He did not cry out. He did not fall to the ground. With the last of his strength, he turned and stumbled back through the courthouse doors. He was a man of the law, and in his final moments, he sought sanctuary in the house of the law. He made it a few feet into the main hall before his legs gave out. Judge James B. Markham collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, his life ending at the very heart of the institution he had died trying to defend. For a long moment, nobody moved. The echo of the shot faded, replaced by a silence that was heavier and more profound than any noise. The people on the street were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. They had just witnessed the unthinkable, the public execution of a circuit judge on the steps of his own courthouse. It was an act of such brazen contempt for the law that it felt like the end of the world. This was not just a murder. It was a coronation. It was a statement, clear and undeniable, about who truly held the power in bloody Breathitt. The assassins, identified as Curtis Jett and Tom White, were known Hargis men. And the message they sent was simple and terrifying. No one was safe. No office was high enough. No principle was strong enough to protect you. The little Czar's reign was absolute, and the courthouse itself was no longer a symbol of justice, but a tombstone for the man who dared to believe in it. From the dusty window of the building across the street, Curtis Jett and Tom White watched their handiwork unfold. The sharp, acrid scent of spent gunpowder hung in the still air of the room, a smell of finality. They saw Judge Markham stagger, saw him disappear back into the courthouse he loved. There was no panic, no rush of adrenaline-fueled fear, only the cold, clean satisfaction of a job well done. They were soldiers who had just successfully completed a mission for their commanding officer. Their next move was a testament to their chilling confidence. They didn't scramble to escape into the mountains. They didn't have a fast horse waiting in a back alley. They simply broke down the rifle, wrapped it in a cloth, and walked down the back stairs. They emerged into the pandemonium of the street, not as panicked fugitives, but as silent observers. They melted into the very crowd that was gathering in horrified knots, their faces as blank and unreadable as any other bystander. They were hiding in plain sight, protected by a shield of terror so absolute that no one dared to even meet their gaze. In the hours that followed, a strange paralysis gripped the town of Jackson. The body of Judge Markham was carried from the courthouse. The local law enforcement made a great show of securing the scene, of asking questions they already knew the answers to. Everyone knew who had pulled the trigger. The motive was as plain as the hole in the judge's chest. But who would dare to make the arrest? The town's legal system had just been decapitated, and the message was clear. Any lawman who tried to bring in Jet and White would be the next one to lie on a cold slab. And so, the killers did not run. They didn't have to. Later that day, they were seen openly in a Jackson store buying tobacco. They walked the streets with a new kind of swagger, the swagger of men who had proven they were untouchable. They were not fugitives cowering in the woods. They were conquerors, and the town of Jackson was their occupied territory. Their freedom in those first hours and days was the ultimate demonstration of Jim Hargis's power. The law was dead, and its assassins were calmly walking over its grave. The end of the road had not come for them. It had come for the rule of law in Breathitt County. The bullet that struck down Judge Markham didn't stop in the courthouse hall. It traveled onward, a phantom projectile that tore through the fabric of his family. For his wife, the abstract fear she had voiced just the night before had become a brutal, life-altering reality. She was now a widow in a town ruled by her husband's killers. His children were now orphans, their name a mark of defiance that placed them in constant, unspoken danger. The very community they had lived in became a prison of watching eyes and silent whispers. Friends who once greeted them warmly now averted their gaze, not out of malice, but out of a primal fear of being associated with the losing side of a war. For the Reform faction, Markham's assassination was a catastrophic blow. He was their legal champion, the man who believed he could slay the dragon with a well-aimed lawsuit. His death was the brutal answer to that belief. It ripped the heart out of their movement, replacing their hope for a lawful victory with the cold, hard reality of terror. A cloud of fear, thick and suffocating as mountain fog, descended on his allies. Men who had spoken boldly of reform now fell silent. The choice they faced was stark and immediate. Flee Breathitt County, bend the knee to the little Czar, or pick up a rifle and answer violence with violence. The murder's ripple effect spread through the entire community. The town of Jackson became a place of profound paranoia. Shutters were bolted earlier in the evening. The streets, once a place of commerce and conversation, grew quiet and empty after dusk. Business between factions ceased entirely. A man's last name became his uniform, and the simple act of walking down the street was a declaration of allegiance. The courthouse, once the center of civic life, was now viewed with dread, no longer a house of law, but a monument to a failed idea. The assassination didn't end the violence, it guaranteed its escalation. The scales of justice, or what passed for it in the mountains, were now grotesquely unbalanced. Such a public and high-profile killing demanded an answer. The cycle of vengeance now required a blood payment of its own, and the Callahan faction, robbed of their legal path, began to see the gun as their only remaining option. The murder of the judge directly led to the murders that followed of the sitting sheriff and then of his successor, Ed Callahan himself. The tragedy of Judge Markham's death was not just his own. The wreckage left behind wasn't just a grieving family and a dead lawman. It was a shattered community, a broken faith in the idea of civilization itself. Jim Hargis had not just eliminated a rival, he had murdered hope. And in its place, he had enthroned fear as the one true king of bloody Breathitt. The murder of a circuit judge was an act so audacious it could not be ignored, not even by the distant state government in Frankfurt. The carnage in Breathitt County had become a national embarrassment. In 1904, the governor declared the county to be in a state of insurrection and sent in the militia. This was not a small detachment of men. It was an invasion force. Hundreds of soldiers armed with modern rifles and Gatling guns arrived on the train, marching through the streets of Jackson with fixed bayonets. They were a foreign army, sent to impose a foreign law. Their primary mission was to ensure that Curtis Jett and Tom White could be tried without the jury being intimidated or the courthouse being burned to the ground. The trial became a spectacle. The courthouse was no longer a public building. It was a military fortress. There were soldiers on the roof, a guard with a bayonet at every door. The proceedings inside were a perfect illustration of the clash between two worlds. The prosecution came with law books, eyewitness testimony from terrified citizens, and the complex machinery of the state's legal system. And on the other side sat Jett and White. They did not carry themselves as common criminals racked with guilt. They sat with a quiet, defiant arrogance, like captured soldiers being tried by an enemy tribunal. In their minds, and in the minds of their supporters, they had broken no real law. They had acted according to the ancient mountain code, loyalty to their chief. They had eliminated a threat to their clan and its leader. Their defense was not one of innocence, but of justification. They were merely the instruments of a will greater than their own, soldiers in a war that the men in powdered wigs could never understand. Outside the courthouse walls, Breathitt County held its breath, deeply and bitterly divided. To the Hargis loyalists, Jett and White were martyrs, loyal men being sacrificed to appease the Flatlanders in Frankfurt. They were symbols of resistance against an outside force trying to change their way of life. To the friends of James Markham and the shattered Reform faction, they were simply assassins. The trial was the last, desperate hope that the rule of law might mean something after all, that a killer could be held to account, no matter who he worked for. After weeks of testimony that kept the entire nation spellbound, the jury, protected by a wall of state rifles, returned its verdict: guilty. Both Curtis Jett and Tom White were sentenced to life in prison. The newspapers declared it a victory for justice. But in the hollows of Breathitt County, the question lingered. Was it justice? The trigger men were going to prison, but the man who had almost certainly loaded the gun and given the order, the man whose power they were protecting, James "Jim" Hargis, was never even charged. The law had proven it could cage the wolves, but it seemed powerless to touch the man who owned the forest. With Jett and White behind bars, you might think justice had finally, imperfectly, triumphed. But the other side of the coin was still in play. James "Jim" Hargis, the little Czar, the man at the center of the storm, remained. The state militia eventually packed up their Gatling guns and went home. The trials were over, and Jim Hargis was still the king of Breathitt County. For years, he walked the streets of Jackson, a living testament to a chilling truth. The law could punish the soldiers, but it couldn't touch the general. He had won. He had broken the reform movement, eliminated his chief rival, and survived the full might of the state's intervention. But the mountains have their own way of balancing the books. The justice that finally found Jim Hargis didn't come with a judge's order or from the rifle of a sworn enemy. It came from inside his own house, from his own blood. In February of 1908, 4 years after the Great Invasion, a bitter argument broke out between Hargis and his son, Beach. We don't know for certain what it was about: money, power, a personal slight. But it was a fire that could not be put out. The very culture of violence that Hargis had cultivated to maintain his power had taken root in his own family. On a cold winter day, on a public street in the town he ruled, the final act of the tragedy played out. Beach Hargis confronted his father, and the argument ended the only way such disputes seemed to end, in bloody Breathitt. He pulled a gun and shot his father dead. The man who had orchestrated assassinations from the shadows, who had treated the county as his personal chessboard, was brought down not by the law or his political enemies, but by a simple, brutal family quarrel. There's a terrible poetic irony in his end. The state of Kentucky had failed to hold him accountable. The code of the mountains, which he had so expertly manipulated, was ultimately what destroyed him. He had lived by the sword of clan loyalty and died by the sword of a family feud. His death was not justice in the legal sense, but it was a grim and fitting final chapter for a man whose greatest legacy was the violence he left behind. With the little Czar in his grave, put there by his own son, a strange and unfamiliar quiet settled over Breathitt County. The empire Jim Hargis had built through a lifetime of cunning and intimidation crumbled like a house of sand. There was no one to inherit his throne. The machine he had created was powered by his will alone, and without him, it ground to a halt. The name Hargis, once a word of power, became a whisper of shame, a cautionary tale of a man who ruled a kingdom and lost his own family. His descendants scattered, many leaving the county to escape the long, dark shadow of their name. On the other side of the ledger, the name Markham became something else entirely. It became a symbol of a lost cause, a ghost of what might have been. Judge Markham's family, seeking the peace he could not find for them in Jackson, eventually left the mountains. But they left his name behind, etched into the memory of the place. To this day, it stands for an honorable, if tragic, idea that the law should be something more than the will of the strongest man. But for the common folk of Breathitt, the years after were not about legacies. They were about survival. A profound and deliberate silence fell over the history of the feuds. It was a collective act of forgetting, a necessary amnesia. Fathers stopped telling their sons the stories. The names of the dead were still on the tombstones, but the reasons they were there were buried deep. To speak of the war was to risk reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar over, to reignite embers of hatred that still glowed in the dark. The community healed itself by cauterizing its own memory, choosing a future of silence over a past of pain. And into this silence, a new kind of power moved in. With the old patriarchs dead or disgraced, the county was left rudderless. The timber and coal companies from the outside no longer had to negotiate with a powerful little Czar. They could now deal with a fractured, exhausted populace and a pliable local government. The great fight for Breathitt's soul did not end with the feuds. It had only entered a new phase. The rifle was put away, and the lawyer's briefcase took its place. The land and its wealth, which had been fought over with blood, would now be claimed with ink. The men who fought the Breathitt County War are long gone. Their rifles have turned to rust, their bodies to dust. But their story has not disappeared. It has seeped into the soil of the county itself, a permanent part of the landscape. And the most enduring echo of that bloody time is the name it earned, Bloody Breathitt. For more than a century, the people of this place have lived with that nickname. It clings to them like morning fog in the hollows, a ghost of a reputation they can never fully shake, a constant reminder of the time when their home was a battlefield. If you walk the streets of Jackson today, you can still touch the past. The old courthouse still stands, a silent brick-and-mortar witness to the murder that defined an era. And a persistent local legend says that the judge never truly left. On quiet nights, when the building is dark and empty, some people claim you can hear the faint sound of a man's footsteps, pacing the hall where Judge Markham fell. It's the ghost of a man who died for the law, still restlessly seeking the justice that was denied to him in life. Not far from there, in a quiet cemetery, you can find the weathered tombstones of Markham, of Hargis, of Callahan, their names worn by 100 years of rain and wind, the silent epilogue to a violent history. The story of the feuds is rarely found in official history books. It lives on in the way mountain people preserve their past, in stories told on a front porch, in hushed tones from one generation to the next. It has become a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to the young about the terrible price of pride and the destructive power of vengeance. The specific details may blur, the names may fade, but the core of the story remains. A warning about the darkness that can be unleashed when good men do nothing and powerful men do as they please. the spirits of the two main antagonists still haunt the county in their own ways. The ghost of Judge Markham is a sad one, a symbol of principle and sacrifice. But the ghost of Jim Hargis is something else entirely. It is the ghost of absolute power, of a time when one man's will could override all law and morality. He represents the old, untamed spirit of the mountains, both its strength and its terrifying brutality. Though the man is gone, his shadow, the memory of that kind of power, lingers as a reminder of what this place once was. So we come to the end of the trail and return to the question that started it all. Was this a land of savages or a place of honorable men locked in a desperate struggle? The truth is, it was both. There were no simple heroes or villains in the story of bloody Breathitt. There were only men, forged by their time and place, and trapped by the very codes that gave them their strength. Jim Hargis was not a monster. He was a king from an older, fiercer world, a mountain patriarch who ruled by a law of loyalty and fear, and who defended his kingdom with savage brutality when it was threatened. And Judge James Markham was not a naive fool. He was a prophet of a new order, a man who believed that the rule of law could tame the wilderness and bring a just peace to the mountains. His tragedy was that he was a man ahead of his time, who fatally underestimated the violence with which the old world would resist its own death. They were two titans of two different ages, standing on the same small piece of earth, and there was simply not enough room for both of them. In the end, this is not just a story about a feud. It is the story of a painful, bloody transition. It's the story of what happens when the unwritten law of the mountains, a code of honor, clan, and vengeance, collides with the written law of the state. The gunshots that echoed through the hollows were the death rattle of an entire way of life, a brutal response to the encroaching forces of industry, money, and a government that the mountain people had never trusted. The blood that soaked the courthouse steps was the terrible price of that change. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of Bloody Breathitt. It is a grim and lasting reminder that a man's greatest strength can become his most profound weakness, and that when the old ways of a place are forced to die, they seldom die quietly.